I'm from the Uyghur region myself, and it's been 4 years I lost contact with my own family, all my sisters and brothers. My last phone call with my brother, when I asked him why no one answering the phone call for 2 months, and he said they did the right thing, and please leave us in God's hands. And then all the activists and people who are living in exile without, they are never involved in any kind of activism. They were in the same situation. So since 2017, the Uyghur persecution, the Chinese persecution against Uyghurs shifted to, their policy shifted as genocidal. Is a genocidal policy. The reason I'm saying the genocidal is the numbers, especially 3 million Uyghurs, my fellow Uyghurs, are interned behind these so-called re-education camps. 500,000, this is a conservative number, have been transported to work as slaves in cotton fields, and hundreds of thousands more forced to work in factories built inside or alongside the camps. 1 million children stolen from their parents and taken to secure boarding schools. It's just like camps as well, children's camps. And 16,000 mosques demolished, hundreds of Muslim graveyards destroyed, millions of women facing forced sterilization, forced abortion, forced marriage to Han Chinese men. And yesterday, the Essex Court Chamber, their report, opinion report, is already online, outlined how there is a credible case that as part of a widespread and systematic attack on Uyghur people in the region, crimes against humanity are taking place, including enslavement, imprisonment, torture, rape, enforced sterilization, enforced disappearance, and persecution. So these are the legal opinion, having read tons of evidence that World Uyghur Congress and other independent researchers, also the survivors, after they have examined this evidence. And now this is the legal opinion. And we also know
Sorry, do you think that the objective is to annihilate a culture or to annihilate the people?
both. I would say say both. Now, we only seen because at the moment China is operating so secretly, and the recent BBC report, as you must have seen, how these women suffered gang rape, and the aim, one of the survivors said, is to destroy us. If we were, even if they didn't kill us, but once we are out from those camps, we are no longer the same. They try to completely destroy people, the religion, the language, the culture, everything. So we don't know whether mass killing happened, but we do know individual cases that there are people dying in these camps. And the fact that they are operating so secretly, not allowing anyone to go and investigate, not allowing people like me, myself, to contact my own family. So there's a fear. We have fear that they have even more the things that we don't know what is happening to those interned. Also, there are a lot of Uyghurs transported to mainland China in many different prisons, and we don't know what happened to them.
Thank you for that. It's a really harrowing story. Um, and having got the practical things of what is happening, I'd like to move on to Professor William Schabas at Middlesex University, um, and ask about the legal framework with which the world now attempts to deal with genocide, and whether it's up to the job.
Well, the crime of genocide has a very precise established legal definition that was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly more than 70 years ago. And it's a, you know, a product of its times. It was at the very beginnings of international criminal justice, and it was the first crime on which the international community could reach a real consensus and an agreement about punishing anyone other than the vanquished in a war. In other words, about exposing themselves to punishment for it as well. And that largely explains why it's defined quite narrowly. It's generally viewed as being a part or a category within a broader phenomenon of criminality that we call crimes against humanity. And when the previous speaker spoke about a widespread or systematic attack on the Uyghur people, this is the language of crimes against humanity, and it fits. And I believe that the Essex Court opinion spoke about crimes against humanity. I haven't read the opinion. I was not able to find it. I saw some of the news accounts, but it spoke about both crimes against humanity and genocide. There's a kind of a fascination with attaching the label genocide to gross and systematic, serious violations of human rights, which is in some ways unfortunate because we end up quarreling about whether the details of the definition of genocide, which are quite narrow, apply to a situation when it's much more evident that the label crimes against humanity applies to it. And that's, I think, it's a bit of a trap in a way. On the one hand, victims feel it's very important that that label genocide be given to their the crimes of which they're victims. But there are often cases, and I think this is probably one of them, where there's a debate about it. I think that the language of the Essex Court Chamber's opinion was quite qualified. It talked about a credible case, whereas I would expect they would be much more convinced about using the term crimes against humanity. And
sorry for interrupting you, but how often has a determination of genocide been made against a state by a competent body?
It's not very often at all. And there are regular charges of it. I mean, it depends what you mean by a competent body. We have these commissions of inquiry at the United Nations created by the Human Rights Council that have on a number of occasions spoken about genocide in Syria, in the Congo, in Myanmar. But when you go to a court, typically what they say in their reports is there are grounds for this being examined by a court to see if it's genocide. And
so when you take it to a court, what's happened so far is that the court has concluded that some other court should decide whether that there is a credible case to present to some other court. But have there been any actual determinations where a competent court has said this is genocide, and consequences have followed?
Two, yes. Definitely in the case of Rwanda, where you had the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda that regularly found suspects. I think there were more than 50 of them who were convicted of genocide. So that's very clearly established. There have been a whole series of cases at both the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and at the International Court of Justice on the issue of genocide in the former Yugoslavia. And what they have done is concluded that one terrible episode in the conflicts, the massacre at Srebrenica of 7,000 to 8,000 people in the space of a few days, has been qualified as genocide. The other cases, the phenomenon of widespread ethnic cleansing during the conflicts in the former Yugoslavia, the courts have rejected those as being deserving of the label genocide, although they've concluded that they amounted to crimes against humanity.
I note that the two countries involved are both very small, very powerless. No case has ever been brought against a large or powerful country, has it?
Well, there have been allegations, of course. When the Genocide Convention was adopted in 1948, there were delegations of African Americans who went to the United Nations with petitions asking the United Nations to take up the issue of genocide in the United States. So there's one example. One of the difficulties with doing this at a court, of course, is whether the court has jurisdiction. The tribunals I've referred to, the Yugoslavia Tribunal and the Rwanda Tribunal, were created by the United Nations Security Council. The Security Council is not going to create a court to prosecute crimes whose responsibility can be attributed to China or the United States or Russia or the UK or France, because they're permanent members and they would veto such a thing. The alternative is to go to the International Court of Justice, and states that have ratified the Genocide Convention can be taken to the International Court of Justice if they haven't made a reservation on that issue to the convention. The convention says that the court has jurisdiction to rule on genocide. China is a state party. China ratified the Genocide Convention in, I think, 1983. But China made a reservation to the article on the International Court of Justice. So I think it's very difficult to find an international court where China could be charged and tried for the crime of genocide.
So this would explain why the amendment in front of the House of Commons this afternoon wants the determination made by a British court, right?
Well, I don't know if it's that, because even if you have a possibility of charging genocide, if China could be taken to the International Court of Justice, it's a determination that might take 3 or 4 years to be made. And I think that the sense is that when we're talking about trade sanctions and measures like that they want to be done promptly, and they want to deal with ongoing cases. And it wouldn't be very satisfactory to say, I'm afraid you're going to have to wait 4 years for such a determination to be made. The other thing, of course, is that the purpose of the legislation, the draft legislation, is to have legal consequences within the United Kingdom in terms of trade. And even a judgment of an international court would have a declaratory effect, but it wouldn't have any impact on trade here. That would be a different matter.
As I understand it, and I may have got this entirely wrong, the amendment applies to formal trade deals. It does not say, and as government spokesman kept saying, we don't have a trade deal at the moment. There is no trade deal in sight. Wait until one comes up. Even if it were passed and even if the determination were made, this would not bind or prompt any British government to choke down trade with China immediately. Have I misunderstood that?
I must tell you, I don't fully understand how that amendment is going to work. I don't know that I can answer that question. What I'm intrigued by about the legislation is simply the fact that a judge of a court here in Britain would be asked to rule on whether another country had committed genocide. And I think that that's probably not practical. And I think it's destined for all kinds of challenges and difficulties. It's quite unprecedented. I don't know of another country that's done it, although there might be one.
How far are we prepared to compromise our principles in pursuit of trade, of money, of jobs in this country, of cheaper prices for everyone, of lovely goods flowing in from Amazon? How far ought we to sacrifice this convenience?
Well, I mean, last night I went out and bought a smart plug to put my heater on in my little shed down the garden here, which I'm in now. It's nice and warm and toasty. I paid about £12 for the smart plug. I probably could have got a Chinese one cheaper, but I didn't.
Right.
And I think we're heading for a boycott of Chinese goods at some point soon, given that China has clearly changed its policy in the way it engages with human rights and the way it engages with the rest of the world. In our World Watch list, which we launched a few weeks ago, which charts the top 50 countries in the world that are persecuting Christians, China's jumped into the top 20 because there's been a shift in policy. Now, this focuses on what's happening to the Uyghurs in China. It would be good to have some kind of clear determination here at home as we broker trade deals. And remember, as I understand it, the revised amendment allows for us to withdraw from trade deals we're presently in, but it would also be a deterrent for us with prospective trade deals. And that's what we recommended in our report. We want our government to champion human rights, particularly religious liberty, as a foundation for other human rights in trade negotiations and deals around the world over the next 10 years. You know, as I understand it, successive governments in the UK have avoided dealing with trade implications regarding genocide. They keep affirming that it should be left a matter for judicial determination. They've been saying this for years, and now there's an opportunity to do this. There seems to be extraordinary opposition and wriggling in Parliament at the moment, and possibly even a wrecking amendment on this, which suggests that it could have an effect.
We have a campaign coalition of 200 organizations came together called Call to Action Forced Labor. And in that we have listed all the companies, brands, big brands that found their supply chains are involved in the Uyghur forced labor. Part of the campaign is to try to reach out to these big corporations and ask them to pull out, cut their supply chains. And the very first company openly announced was Marks and Spencer's only recently. And so I think as consumers, not only just boycott, but also can reach out to these big brands and ask them to, the work ethics and moral duty, that in the end, it makes huge difference. But of course, I believe the legal mechanism and also the trade sanction can work as well. I mean, it is necessary.
Right. Okay, Christopher Lamb has a question for the entire panel, which is whether it wouldn't be better to use diplomatic pressure, especially in conjunction with Muslim countries, against Beijing rather than attempt this sort of economic warfare. What do you think?
I think it's a combination of things that are needed here. I mean, clearly there's been diplomatic pressure applied for many years with China. And the reality is probably without the global pandemic, we probably wouldn't have the media focus we've got now on China's human rights record and its use of effectively slave bonded labor to produce cheap goods for the West to undercut Western companies. Now, I'm aware that, a boycott of a particular company is effective, but a boycott of an empire, a digital empire as well, by the way, it takes a complete culture shift, a consciousness shift in the West to do that. And I don't see how diplomatic pressure alone can move the Chinese. There's been a policy change in China with its engagement with the rest of the world to disregard human rights. And, we've got real concerns about the surveillance state in China and the installing of facial recognition cameras in churches, the destruction of churches across China. And without some kind of consumer pressure, it's the economic base that gives China its political muscle. And it's going to be a long haul. I've got no doubt these kind of things can take decades sometimes, but we've got to start somewhere. And I think we need an adjudication, a determination of whether genocide is actually happening as a base for that.
Well, I think the amendment wouldn't be operational until there is a judicial determination. So that would be the first challenge, is that you would have to go before the courts and see if you could figure out how to get such a determination. That's where the complexity is. It may sound like it's a matter of showing up and giving a file to a judge and coming back the next morning and getting an opinion. but I think that it's likely to be far more complicated. It's not even obvious who would be the parties in who would make the application, and then the likelihood that it would be disputed is large. And if you're charging another country, if they were to send either their own legal representatives or some loyal NGO to defend their interests, you might find you have a very long hearing underway. There will be complex rules about evidence, what evidentiary standard is a judge to apply. It's something they're not familiar with. It's not as if we have a list of judges in the UK who are specialists on international criminal law or on the law of genocide. So I see huge problems there in terms of how it would be implemented. Once that's done, then the question is, what's the consequence of the law? I should add, by the way, that it looks like it could be a very costly undertaking. As you know, going to court is never inexpensive. And depending on the length of the proceedings, it could be quite complicated. So I'm just very skeptical about the viability of the whole process. And I would think that it's a curious initiative, but if you want to do something concrete with some chance of an impact in a reasonable period of time, I think that you probably need to devote your energy somewhere else than to trying to make that amendment work.
Okay, well, Ben Cohen asks the counter question, and if the amendment doesn't pass, what should happen next?
So it is going to go back to the Lords, from what I know. It will go back to the Lords, and then maybe do some changes, whatever, and then once it passes the Lords, and then come back to the Commons. So it's not going to completely kill today, apparently. So there will be, it takes longer.
I mean, it would be disappointing if it didn't pass, but it would send a shot across the bows, as it were, in terms of the discourse around our trade negotiations going forward. And we've got lots of trade negotiations ahead. So I do hope it would bring a realization to the government that we simply cannot leave human rights out of our economic deals that we strike with countries around the world. I mean, and again, I agree with the last contributor. I'm not a lawyer, and I do acknowledge the complexities that have just been laid out there, but I do believe that where there's a will, there's a way. You can make this work. You can set a high bar, and we can get a determination as to whether genocide is occurring or not.